Hey guys, I promised everybody in my last video that I would make a follow-up video to show you how I did the trigger job on my Ruger Gunsite scout rifle. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I'm going to completely break this down. I'm going to show you exactly what I did. I have the materials here that I used. It's extremely simple. Number one rule, take your time. If you have to do it 5 or 6 times until you get it right, you're better off doing that than taking too much material off your trigger and your sear the first time, having to replace it, or making your rifle unsafe. That's the last thing you want to do. Now, to start, there's going to be 2 takedown screws, one under your action here and one in front of your mag well. It's going to be a 3/16 and a 5/32. So the one in front is a 3/16. We're going to go ahead and I'm going to take that out right now. Okay, and then we have the 5/32 in the rear. Now, if any of you guys are like really worried about diving into this project, because I understand it could seem overwhelming. It's safety related. You obviously want to keep your rifle safe. It's not that hard. It's actually very simple. You just got to take your time. You have to pay attention. Okay. So just going to separate from the stock. Alright, so this is what we're left with now. Okay. Your trigger, obviously you have your bolt assembly. Okay. So in order to take your bolt out, you should know this by now, but just rack it. Okay. There is a lever on the side. You're going to pull that out, and your bolt's just going to come right out. Now, part of the trigger job to do it right is you actually need to polish some places on the bolt. I polished my whole bolt surface just because there is a slight graininess to the finish on it, and I wanted to polish it up nice. I used 1,000 to start and 1,500 to finish. Now, underneath your bolt, this little lug right here, you need to polish this surface. Okay, so I started with 1,000, went down to 1,500 until I had a nice smooth surface, as well as in this little nook, that little 90-degree angle in there, that needs to be polished as well. You don't want to change the angle, you don't want to take material out of there, you just want to polish it. Okay, so if you have a Dremel with a buffer wheel on it and some buffing paste, you can use that. I used 1,500 grit wet dry sandpaper, a little bit of oil, and I just polished it to a mirror finish. So that's your first step. Now, all you need for this is a punch. This is just a simple, actually this is a nail set, but you can use a pin punch, you can use a nail set, anything that'll fit. And I suggest getting a polymer hammer instead of a steel hammer, because if you miss, if you hit anything, you're not going to damage your rifle. So there is a pin located right there that goes through your trigger. There is also a pin right here, I don't know if you can see that, that goes through the back, and that is to remove your sear. We're going to start with the trigger. All you have to do is push that down. Now, I didn't even have to use the hammer. Mine just pushed right out. And what you want to do is you want to hold the top of your trigger here, pull your pin out or your punch out, because there is a little bit of pressure on that spring. So as you lift that up, that spring is going to fall out. Make sure you set that aside. Don't lose that. And now, also, don't lose your pin, because your pin is very small. Set that with your spring. Your trigger. This is your trigger. Okay. Now, you have 2 engagement surfaces on your trigger. One on the back, which is this flat surface here, and one on the top, which is this flat surface here. Now, one of the problems with the pull on these triggers is that there is a positive engagement surface. And what that means is, instead of having a perfect 90-degree angle here coming off the back, it is slightly raised, almost like a AR-15 mil-spec trigger. You actually have to increase resistance throughout the pull until it finally breaks. So the main thing to do is to turn this angle from top to back as close to a perfect 90 degrees as possible. This is 1500 automotive wet dry sandpaper. What I did is I took my time. I did this on a flat surface. You need to make sure you have a very flat surface. I have an anvil on the back of my vise which has a machined flat surface, so I knew it was flat. You don't want to do this on anything grainy because you're trying to keep a flat, consistent surface underneath your sandpaper. So what I did is I made sure, okay, so take your trigger on the top of that, set it on the sandpaper until it sits flat. Okay. Now rock the trigger back a few degrees and start to drag it slowly. You don't have to put a lot of pressure on it. You may have to drag it 20 times, you may have to drag it 200 times. But you don't want to put a lot of pressure. You want to take your time, and what it's going to do is it's slightly going to take a little bit of that material off the back of the shoulder. It's going to start to flatten it at a slightly different angle. You don't need to do it to the whole top, just the very back. That's the only section that's going to engage your sear, is just the very lip on the top. You want to bring that to a 90-degree angle and polish it. Once you've got that to a 90-degree angle, you want to polish the other surface on the back. Okay, so you can see on mine, it's nice and shiny on both top and bottom. Don't take off more material than you need to. If you need to reassemble the action, cycle it a few times, test your trigger pull, take it back apart and keep doing it. You're better off doing that than taking off too much the first time and turning this into a brick. So that being said, let's move on to the sear. This other pin, okay, so the other pin's going to be right here, and the same thing. This, I believe, is a tapered pin, so if your safety selector is on top, you're going to knock the pin out through the bottom. And then again, it's also going to have to come back in through the bottom to reassemble. Okay. So that came right at the bottom. That pin's a little bit bigger. Set that aside. And then you can basically pull forward and out, and your sear will come out. Now this is your sear. And if you'll notice, try to get you a better picture here, that there is a gap right here in your sear. And you'll notice that the bottom, with this little nub facing up, the bottom face sticks out further than the top face. If you're to drag your finger across that, you can feel your finger catch. Now that's your sear engagement surface. And what we're going to do, now this is only if you want to remove any creep out of your trigger. If you like your trigger pull and you want to not take any chances of making your rifle unsafe, and you just want to decrease the poundage of your trigger, you don't have to touch your sear at all. You can just do the first step that I described and never touch this. This is your safety feature right here. If you take off too much material, you will make your rifle unsafe. Online, I read that the most material you want to take off for that face is 21 thousandths. I took off about 15. And again, this whole back was not polished. I polished all this. You don't want to change the radius angle. You just want to polish it again. Just putting it on sandpaper and lightly dragging it across on the 1500 grit. You could use a polishing wheel and a Dremel. But this face on top here, you want to take that down a little bit. You still want the engagement surface to catch there. No more than 21 thousandths. If you don't have a micrometer, or if you don't have fine enough sandpaper, and if you don't have, I should say, the confidence to do it. It really doesn't, it's not that hard to do. You just really, really, really want to take your time, a little bit at a time. You're better off, like I said, doing it 10 times and getting it right on the 10th time than overdoing it on the first time and making your gun unsafe or having to buy a whole new trigger kit. So once you've got that polished down, you're just going to reassemble it. That little nub, when it goes back in your receiver, is going to point down because your spring is going to sit on that. You're going to put it back in through the bottom and tilt it in. And then that pin, like I said, is going to have to come in through the bottom. Put that in. I'm having an issue with this. Sometimes it can be a pain to line up the hole. Alright, and we are in. Okay, so now the sear is back in. You can see the little nub sticking up there. That's how you want to index it. Push your pin back through. Your last step is going to be to put a lighter spring in. Now I went down to my Ace Hardware store and I went through a spring bin, and the spring that comes in this rifle is actually it's very stiff. The compression on it is very hard. So what I did is I went down and I got the same diameter spring. This one ended up being a lot longer, so I had to cut it and then fold the end in. But I got one that was about half the spring rate of the one that was in here. I bought like 6 or 7 springs, all the same diameter, but different densities. So it was different like squish rate, and I brought them home and I cut them all to the same length as the stock spring, put them in there and experimented, and I ended up with this spring. What I'll do is I'll find out what the part number on the spring was, and I will write it in the comment box below. Cut it to length. What you want to do is you want to put that spring right there on top of your sear, and you're going to take your trigger and you're going to put it down in there, and it's going to go onto the little nub on your trigger. And then while you're holding that down, you're just going to pop your little pin back in to your trigger housing there, and that's it. Everything's back together. Now before you put this all back in your stock, take and cycle your action. Okay, rack your action. Test it out. Okay, rack your action. Test it out. Put your safety on. Rack your action. Put your safety. Put it on half safety. Make sure you can't pull the trigger. Rack it. Close it. Make sure you can't pull the trigger. Put it on full safety. Make sure you can't pull the trigger. Take it back off. Make sure everything is functional before you put a live round in here. That's the last thing you want to do, is put this all back together and find out that you've taken off too much material somewhere and that the rifle is unsafe. You don't want it going off. You don't want to have an accident. Now, whatever your trigger pull is here is going to feel a lot lighter once you get the action back in the stock, because you have more leverage pulling this trigger when it's back in the stock. So even though you might think it's still a little bit heavy for your likings, before you put it all back together, put it back in the stock and then test it, because it's going to feel lighter. You don't want to make this thing so light that once you get it back into the gun, you just bump it and it goes off. So I'm down to about 2.5 pounds now. After you get it to where you want it, just put it back in the stock and go ahead and put your action screws back in. Now, just so you know, there are specified torques for these action screws. There are a lot of people that complain about this gun, and a lot of people that complain that they don't get good accuracy out of it, or that it's inconsistent. Ruger has said that 90% of those complaints come from improperly torqued action screws. There is a torque value for these. I'm not going to say it because I'm not going to be held responsible if somebody messes up and they strip out their action. But it is in inch pounds. Now, inch pounds compared to foot pounds is a huge difference. If you have a torque wrench and it's in foot pounds, it's not going to work. Get one in inch pounds because 90 inch pounds is only about 7 foot pounds. If you go to torque this thing down to like 60, 70, 80, 90 foot pounds by mistake, you're going to strip everything out. Your gun's going to be useless. Go online, go on Ruger's website. They actually have a YouTube video, I believe it's from Ruger themselves, that talks about the problem that M77 actions have with improperly torqued action screws. Look it up. You'll know exactly where it needs to be. It's going to improve your accuracy. Also, people talk about how this gun is not an MOA gun at 100 yards. Yes, it is, and it's actually better than an MOA at 100 yards. I hand load. I did my trigger job. I make sure everything's properly torqued and that my barrel is properly free-floated, because even though they say they come free-floated, sometimes they touch. Make sure it's completely free-floated. With my hand loads and iron sights, I'm getting a half MOA at 50 yards. I'm getting sub MOA at 100 yards. With a scope, even better. So it can be done. You need good ammo. The other thing too, the one other thing that I did with this rifle that I haven't mentioned is I bought some JB bore paste, and I ran it down the barrel about 15-20 times. What it does is it polishes the rifling, gives a more consistent finish, takes the tooling marks out of your barrel. So my rifle is easier to clean and my shots are more consistent. So that's something you can try out. You can go on Brownells, maybe Midway USA sells it. JB bore paste, take your time. Don't take out more material than you need to. It's just a polish for the inside of your bore, and it smooths out tooling marks. So leave me some comments in the comment box. Hopefully you could see everything I was trying to show you here. If not, ask me some questions. I will leave you some answers. Take your time, be safe, and enjoy and love your rifle. This is probably one of my favorite rifles I've ever had and will continue to be. I love this thing, and it is accurate. Once you're done with this, look at my subsonic loads, make some, and have a whole bunch of quiet fun. They're super accurate, and they have some serious knockdown. So leave me some comments. Enjoy.